up in the belly.
Oh, all right. I'll read some more. No, there's father coming, cried the two young Cratchits who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide. So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of the comforter's exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed and to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. Not coming, said Miss Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob, with a sudden declension of his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come rampant. Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, and the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off with a wash house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Asked Miss Cratchit, when she rallied Bob on his credulity? Don't know. And Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow, he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you have ever heard. He told me coming home that he had hoped people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for him to remember on Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice tremulous when he told him this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and came back Tiny Tim before another word was spoken. Escorted by his brother and sister to his stool, spoke before the fire, while Bob was turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug, gin and lemons, and stirred it around, put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, from which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Miss Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with an incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner of the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everyone, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, the grace was said. It was successful by a breathless pause as Miss Cratchit, looking slowly along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, the long-expected gush of stuffing and soup issued forth. One murmur of delight arose from around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family, indeed, as Miss Cratchit said with a great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish. They hadn't ate it all at last, yet every one had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now the plate's been changed to Miss Belinda, and Miss Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness. To take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break and turn out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, and supposition at which two young Cratchits became lived. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Lo, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. It smelled like washing day. That was cloth. Smelled like an eating house. The pastries cooked next door to each other, with the laundresses next door to that. And that was the pudding. In half a minute, Miss Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling profoundly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and a bed light with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Miss Cratchit since their marriage. Miss Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was all a small pudding for a large family. Would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have been blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, and the cloth was cleared, and the hearth swept, and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put on the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one. And at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as the golden goblets. They would have done. Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. And then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears." "God bless us," which the family echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his stool. Bob held in his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest that he'd never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race, returned the ghost, will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. Man, said the ghost, if man you be in heart, not adamant forbear, the wicked can't hear until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what man shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust. Scrooge bent before the ghost rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob. I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. The founder of the feast, indeed, cried Miss Cratchit, reddening. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a very good appetite for it. My dear, said Bob, the children, Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, she said, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow. My dear, was Bob's mild answer, on Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake, and the days, said Miss Cratchit. Not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, and I have no doubt. Children drank the toast after her. It was the first of the proceedings, which had no heartenings. Tiny Tim drank it last of all. He didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had been passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire between his collars, as if he was deliberating what particular investments he should favor when it came to the receipt of the bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at the milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she had worked a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning and for a long good time rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had been a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and round. By and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who would plain a little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this, They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon 'em, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By this time it was getting dark, snowing pretty heavily, and Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets. The brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchen and the parlors and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here was the flickering light of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner with hot plates and bacon through and through before the fire, and the deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the dark, cold curtains. There were all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, and to be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and their group of handsome girls, and all hooded and fur-booted, and all a-chattering at once, tripped lightly off into some neighbors' houses, where woe upon the single man who saw them enter. Artful witches, well, they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged from numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was sitting at home to give them a welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company, the piling up of the fires, every chimney high, lessons on it, how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breath of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very implier who ran on before, dotting the dusky street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed through, little kind lamplighter, and had a company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it was a barrier place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west, setting sun had left a streak of fiery red which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye frowning lower yet. It was lost in the thick gloom of the darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me, see?" A light shone from the window of the hut. Swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire. An old man and a woman with their children and their children's children, another generation beyond, had all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy. It was from time when they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely they all stopped and the vigor sank again. The Spirit did not tarry on here. but bade Scrooge hold his robe, passing them on above the moors, sped with her, not to see, to Scrooge's horror looking back, he saw the last of the land, frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn. Fiercely tried to undermine the earth, built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from a shore. Reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from a shore. Built upon the dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed. The wild year through there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose that seaweed of the wet water, rose and fell above it. Like waves they skimmed. But even here, two men watched the light that made the fire through the loophole in a thick stone wall out of ray of brightness of the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table which they sat. They wished each other a Merry Christmas in their own can of grog, and one of them, the elder two, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as a figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heavy sea, on and on until far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore lighted up the ship that stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, and the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes of belonging to it, and every man on board walking or sleeping, good or bad, and had a kinder word for another on that Christmas any day in the year, that shared to some extent in its festivities, and remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him.